I'm James Maynor. I teach in the School of Advanced Study, Institute of Commonwealth Studies in the University of London. And today we have a discussion of India's dilemmas, its travails, and we're paying particular attention at times to media freedom in India, which is under threat. We are recording this discussion for those of you who may want to make comments later. Please post your questions if you have them in the question and answer, the Q&A facility, and I will try to enable some of you at least to join that discussion with your own questions. But our guest today is Karan Thapar, an immensely eminent Indian analyst, public intellectual, and journalist. And it's rather odd that I should be interviewing him because he is the most prolific interviewer that India has on the media scene. He does a series of interviews with prominent people in India practically on a daily basis. And these interviews are available on a very independent and brave media outlet, the online magazine or newspaper, The Wire. And I recommend his interviews to you. They're hugely informative and often quite courageous. So Karan, welcome, and we're very grateful for your time. Can I begin by saying that many of the people who are participating here are not familiar with all of the details of India's recent history. And could I ask you therefore briefly to sum up the concerns that have come up about India's experiences first of a drive for authoritarian control by the current government and the Narendra Modi government, and second, the surge in Hindu nationalist efforts to promote what I think we must call hate towards religious minorities, and especially towards India's Muslims, who make up 14% of the population. Do you have can you give us a kind of quick overview of all that?
I think there are 4 areas in particular where I, as an individual, am particularly concerned about the trends that are developing in my country. And the word trends is a euphemism because these are now well-established patterns that are visible to everyone and have been over the last 8 years. The first is the authoritarian nature of the regime, at the apex of which is the Prime Minister. There is a cult of personality around him. He not only dominates his cabinet as primus inter pares, but frequently cabinet decisions are taken in the Prime Minister's office rather than in the respective line ministries. It is increasingly, if I can use that somewhat hackneyed, cliched phrase, a one-man government. Authoritarianism of a sort that India has not witnessed for 30 years, 35 years since the emergency, has established itself almost without question. That's the first key concern. The second is the emergence, growth, and deliberate and conscious nurturing of majoritarianism. There is 2 parts to this. The first is an alleged pride in being Hindu, the phrase "Garv se kaum hai Hindu hu," say with pride, I am a Hindu, and the assertion of a Hindu identity. That on its own would not be so worrying, except for the fact that it usually is accompanied by equivalent dislike, distaste, despising of Muslims, the treating of Muslims as if they are second-class citizens, the othering of Muslims. For a very long time, Muslims, in terms of their representation, whether it's politically, whether it's in government service, whether it's in the army, whether it's in the civil service, has been way, way below their share of the population. But what is now happening is a social attempt, often with the complicit acknowledgement, if not encouragement, of respective governments, be it the central government or the state governments, to treat Muslims as if they are the other, they are the enemy. So you have beef lynching campaigns, knowing that beef is a product that Muslims sell. You have love jihads, this spurious, mysterious belief that somehow Muslim men are determined to fall in love with Hindu girls and marry them as a way of converting them and increasing the Muslim population. You had in Hardwar in December, blood-curdling calls for a genocide of Muslims. You have Hindu preachers wearing saffron robes, claiming that for every Muslim fault or every Muslim crime, they will personally rape Muslim women. And then there is a third aspect of this, which is the fact that the judiciary frequently, and I'm trying to use the words carefully here, frequently doesn't give these issues the importance they deserve. Many of them are backpedaled. In many instances, the judiciary turns a blind eye, but there have been one or two cases pretty recently where judges have spoken out boldly. One or two cases where they fail to act at all. But the attitude of the judiciary, not just to Muslim issues, but generally to issues where there is a conflict with the government, has been to suggest that give the government more time, put the issue on the back burner in the hope that with time it'll sort itself out. The Citizenship Amendment Act is one example. The constitutional changes that have happened in Kashmir are another example. The entire issue about funding of political parties and the legitimacy of that procedure is another issue. So the concerns about the judiciary are a third. And then there is this question of dissent, which is where journalism fits in. This is a system, this is a government, I should say more pointedly, that dislikes criticism, it dislikes dissent, it attempts to quash it, it punishes you for it. Many journalists have been done for sedition, many journalists have been done under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. And what happens is that fear is driven into institutions like newspapers and channels who do not speak out because they either get a phone call from someone in authority to be told this would not be acceptable, or advertisers and sponsors who are vital to the survival of commercial television or commercial newspaper ventures back out because they don't want to be associated with an institution or an organization that is critical. I would identify those four. There are many others that I could carry on to talk about, but I would identify those four as the key concerns: authoritarianism, majoritarianism, the general weakening of the judiciary, particularly vis-a-vis the government, and the whole issue of dissent, into which the treatment of journalists fits squarely.
Thank you very much. That was admirable and very clear. Recently, you interviewed Reuben Banerjee, who was formerly the chief editor of the Outlook News Group, but a man who was sacked under pressure, apparently, from the Hindu right, the kind of pressure you were alluding to. And several other editors, many of them eminent, have also been sacked at other news outlets over recent months. The result of this is that Reporters Without Borders, in its ranks of press freedom, placed India 136th out of 180 2 years ago, then 142nd out of 180 last year, and this year it's slipped further so that India now stands at the 150th position out of 180 countries. This is very depressing for a country that once had a flourishing media and an independent-minded media. And I'm just wondering how the sackings and the intimidation of media companies happens. You've begun to tell us, but I think that you were suggesting that the government has both sticks and carrots to use. Does that sound right to you?
It does indeed have sticks, more sticks than carrots, but there are a few carrots as well. The most obvious way in which is when you are a Reuben Banerjee and you get sacked by your proprietor because you published an issue of Outlook magazine, which the proprietor has been told by the government is far too critical, not acceptable. Pressure is brought to bear on the proprietor. And over a period of time, in Reuben's case, it didn't happen immediately. Over a period of 3 months, he was put in a position where it was impossible for him to continue. His decisions were being questioned. His right to publish articles or to carry out inquiries into certain areas which were critical to the government was being questioned. And eventually he was in fact told in an email that his services had been terminated. That is the most obvious and direct way when the government directly contacts a proprietor and makes it clear that it is unacceptable what has been done. The penalty that follows is the sacking of the editor. Reuben is absolutely convinced that the pressure for his sacking came from the government. It's there in his book. But there are other more subtle and invidious ways in which pressure is brought to bear on journalists. Firstly, newspapers and television are often dependent upon government advertising. Government is the biggest advertiser in the business in India. If a government doesn't like a particular channel or a particular newspaper, they deliberately start reducing or cutting off the advertising. That immediately attracts the attention of the proprietor, because without advertising, you go into losses. And once again, the proprietor reaches out. Some sort of quid pro quo is arranged whereby the offending journalist or the offending issue of that magazine or the offending program are silenced and done away with. A third way is when, and this happens particularly in television, it happened in my particular case, so I could speak about it with a fair degree of confidence. The government, the ruling party, or its spokesman decide that they will boycott you. In other words, what I mean is they will stop appearing on your programs. Now, if you're a television anchor whose business is to either do one-to-one programs, one-to-one interviews, or discussion programs, it is impossible to continue without some form of participation with a member of the government or a member of the ruling party. You cannot balance the discussion. So if the government decides or the ruling party decides that they will boycott X program or X anchor, they're making it impossible for the individual to function. And over a period of time, it becomes pretty clear to the channel that if this individual or this program is continued with, the boycott could expand beyond the individual and beyond the program to the channel as a whole. Once again, therefore, pressure is brought to bear on the proprietors to end the program or dismiss or not renew the contract of the anchor or the journalist concerned. A third way is when you tweet something and you may get it marginally, fractionally wrong, sedition charges or UAPA charges are brought against you. The most famous instance is, and I don't remember the precise details, but it happened during the January period of last year when it was alleged that a Sikh who was protesting against the farm laws had died as a result of an accident with a police vehicle. I believe that was the story. I'm not 100% sure if I'm correct in my details. 2 or 3 or 4 journalists tweeted about it. 1 or 2 of them quoted the young Sardar's father, who claimed that in fact his son had died as a result of this incident. It turns out that that was questionable. Whether it was true or not, we still don't know for sure, but it turns out it was questionable. And in several instances, cases were brought against people who had tweeted that information, even though those tweets were withdrawn and those tweets were corrected. But cases were brought on the grounds of spreading false information. That is another way of intimidating people. And a final way is to simply frighten people. And you frighten people in a multiple series of ways. Phone calls go to editors that a particular person, a particular article, a particular way of covering a story is not acceptable. Please don't do it. Or what's even worse is that you find ministers will ring up and say to their to sponsors or to advertisers directly, or their secretaries, not their personal secretaries, but the secretaries in the ministry, I think it's called permanent undersecretary in England, will ring up sponsors and advertisers to say, we see that you're supporting X's program or X's channel. We don't think it's a friendly thing to do. And because companies obviously have to maintain their interests, their commercial interests with the government, they will slowly, sometimes very rapidly, wind down their relationship. So in these multiple ways, pressure can be brought on the media, on individuals within the media, on programs within channels to conform or simply to cancel them out.
Thank you for that. I think there's another element we might look at in that connection. The central government in this federal system has control of 11 investigative agencies, the Income Tax Authority, the Enforcement Directorate, which deals with problems from the financial side, the Central Bureau of Investigation, et cetera, et cetera. And the current government has flagrantly misused these agencies to mount raids against people, raids on spurious grounds, against people who are basically have independent views that the government is unhappy with. And we've seen the owners and the editors of media houses raided when the government is unhappy. There was an occasion where a major Hindi language newspaper, Dainik Bhaskar, published an article critical of the government, and almost immediately 30 offices and homes of members of that organization were raided in order to intimidate the newspaper and the group from pursuing that line. But the raids have also been used against opposition leaders, opposition party leaders, against civil society organizations, even including a Nobel Peace Prize winner, Amnesty International, which has been forced to close its office in India. And the raids have been used against senior figures in the corporate sector and against an election commissioner who had independent views. I just wonder if you think this is another serious complication in the lives of journalists and others who might wish to voice independent views.
It's an extremely important concern. It's more than just a complication, Professor Mehna. It's a weapon in the hands of the government to frighten, to bring into line, to corral, and to ensure that no one speaks out of turn. And it's not just journalists that it's used against. Remember, the National Narcotics Board was used against Shah Rukh Khan's son, Aryan Khan, who was barely 24, 25 at the time. He was falsely and wrongly accused of being in the possession of drugs. The entire case turned out to be a farce. And in the event, it had to be investigated by the National Narcotics Board itself, and they realized they didn't have the basis even to charge him. The whole case was false and fraudulent from the word go. Similar things have happened to journalists like Siddiq Kappan. Siddiq Kappan is a young journalist who was on his way, I believe it was to Hathras, to investigate the killing of a particular lady who'd earlier been raped. He hadn't even got there. He hadn't even written his story, and he was arrested and charged under sedition or under UAPA, one of the two, maybe both. And nearly 2 years have passed and he hasn't got bail. Disha Ravi is another. She was lucky she got bail. But there are multiple instances. Muhammad Zubair is another classic example. Muhammad Zubair was the young founder editor of Alt News. Alt News is a fact-checking website that exposes false fake news. Much of the news that they expose happens to come from the BJP family or even sometimes from members of the government. One of the things that he exposed was Nupur Sharma's rather blasphemous comments about the Prophet. If I recall the story correctly, and forgive me if I'm wrong, Nupur Sharma denied she had said anything of the sort when it first emerged that she had made these blasphemous comments. He produced on Twitter the exact clip of the moment when she said what she claimed she had not said, thus confirming that she'd said it. As a result of which, he was then arrested on the grounds that he had, in 2018, 4 years earlier, tweeted something that was deemed to be hateful and offensive and spreading enmity between religions. And what it was a meme from a Hindi movie that was made in 1983. So remember, his tweet was 4 years old in 2018. It carried a meme from a Hindi movie that was made in 1983, a movie that had been cleared by the censor board, a movie that had been shown multiple times on national television. The person who drew the police's attention was a Twitter handle that apparently only got created in October 21. And if I recall my facts from the Hindu newspaper correctly, it barely tweeted 3 times. The first time to draw attention to the police and ask them to inquire into this meme of 2018. And the second 2 times was to get people to watch it. Now that was completely farcical. As one of the most important judges of the Indian Supreme Court, former Judge Deepak Gupta, said to me, he was astounded that in fact this young man had been charged in the first place. There were no grounds for arresting or charging him at all. And secondly, he says what was even worse is that the court had not granted him bail immediately. It was a lower magistrate court. He said the court should have said, if for 4 years this has been known to you and it's created no problem in society and there was nothing untoward that's happened and no reason to arrest the man, why are you arresting him today? And here you have a classic example of 2 organs of the Indian state malfunctioning. The police deliberately targeting a young man, presumably because he's Muslim, presumably because he exposed Nupur Sharma, presumably because that led to the embarrassment India faced in Gulf countries, which was quite a serious diplomatic setback for the country. And the second thing it exposes is that the courts failed to stand up for the human rights of an Indian citizen, which they should have done.
When we consider these problems, we might think that perhaps the opposition parties in the Indian political system could pose an impediment to the trends that you're describing and to the strength of the continuing strength of the BJP government. The leaders of the BJP take a very dim view of the opposition. Amit Shah, who is India's home minister, but also Modi's right-hand man, has described opposition parties with utter contempt as snakes, rats, cats, and dogs. Now, opposition parties have often defeated the ruling BJP in state elections in this federal system. But in national elections, in the last 2 national elections, the personality cult of Narendra Modi and the huge financial strength of the BJP, the huge advantage it has over other parties, won the BJP solid victories. At the last parliamentary election in 2019, the BJP had 18 times more money to spend than all other parties put together. And since then, the disparity between the BJP and all opposition parties has grown. The financial disparity has increased. So this playing field is not level. But the opposition still manages to win state level elections on many occasions. But the opposition is fragmented. And the main opposition party, the Congress Party, is in disarray and apparently in some decline. And there are worries about the wayward leadership of Rahul Gandhi in the Congress Party. I'm just wondering whether you see much hope from these parties.
I think at the regional level, parties like Mamata Banerjee's Trinamool Congress or Chandrasekhar Rao's Telangana Party or the DMK in Tamil Nadu or the CPM in Kerala are very forceful parties, or the Aam Aadmi Party in Delhi and Punjab are very forceful, effective, and will likely continue to be so in checking the BJP in those regions, in those states where they have a one-to-one fight with them. However, there are other parties that are equally effective and equally in control of their regions, but do not actually stand up to the BJP. They try and find via media of collaboration or support, or at least a way of getting along with, because remember, state governments do depend for a lot of finance and a lot of grants on the central government. I'm talking now of the Orissa Party, the Biju Janata Dal, or the Andhra Party, the YSR Congress Party. These are parties that have a major, almost vice-like hold on their regions, but are not opponents of the BJP in the way in which the Trinamool, the DMK, the TRC are opponents of the BJP. But at the national level, we do not have a national party that is capable of standing up to the BJP. Congress is in, I would say, something pretty close to terminal decline. It would take a miracle, and it's unimaginable to me what sort of miracle that would be that would revive the party. A lot of the blame lies in the fact that the Gandhis no longer count for what they did, and yet they remain in control of their party. And whilst they remain in control of their party, other voices, other people, other talented politicians cannot rise to the top. This is an internal debate that has been going on within the Congress party from the moment it first lost elections in 2014, but in a far more intense way since 2019 when they lost their second election. And although Rahul Gandhi has stopped being party president, in effect, from behind the scenes, he runs the party. Similarly, his mother is the interim president and has been for the last 3 years. But in effect, even though she's an interim president, she has all the powers of a full-fledged president and runs the scene. There have been groups within the Congress like the G23 that attempted in different ways to reform the party internally, to introduce internal democracy, to get its internal organizations, its internal committees to be functioning properly, whether it's the parliamentary committee or the Congress working committee or other such institutions within Congress to function properly, but they have not succeeded. And there's no doubt that whenever Congress elections are held, if Rahul Gandhi were to put himself forward as a candidate, and maybe that word if should be not if, but when he puts his name forward, he will win hands down, because either no one will stand against him, or even if someone were to, the dominance of the Gandhis within the Congress family is such is that they will win. The problem is the view congressmen have of the Gandhis, assuming that the majority of congressmen look upon the Gandhis as irreplaceable, is not shared by the rest of the country. Rahul Gandhi is popularly joked about and called Pappu. Pappu is a comic figure, or it is a polite, childlike term for a sweet dolt of a child, innocent, naive, not the sort you make prime minister. And when the country begins to call you Pappu, even if they do it with affection at times, although it's not done with affection in this case, it's impossible to believe that they will elect Pappu to be prime minister. Rahul Gandhi seems to lack several qualities that others believe are essential in a prime minister, and certainly they are starkly missing when you compare him to the present prime minister, Narendra Modi. He is not a great speaker, and his ability to rouse audiences is very limited. Secondly, his diligence and dedication. He's frequently on holiday. As you and I speak, he's abroad again. The impression has gone through, and it doesn't matter whether it's factually accurate or not, that at moments of crisis, Rahul Gandhi is missing. That's the second problem. The third is that he doesn't seem to have won the confidence of the old guard in the party, bar a handful. Many of the others who were critical to the Congress's functioning under his mother or under Dr. Manmohan Singh are distant from him, and he's done very little to reach out to them. Fourthly, some of the young people that he's brought in have lacked, I won't say talent, but they've lacked the capacity to succeed. And that is so critical. You may be talented, but if you're not successful, if you're not lucky, you're not a clever, useful politician. Luck is a very important quality. And that finally is perhaps the problem. Rahul Gandhi has run out of luck. He's been considered an implausible politician, a person lacking in credibility, a pappu, as people call him, for so long that it is impossible to change his image, and to persist in the belief that perhaps by 2 years from now or 6 years from now, he will be a different human being perceived differently, is to persist with a very illogical, irrational idea.
Yes, thank you very much for that. I think we should also note that in recent months, Rahul Gandhi, despite all of the problems that you're describing, has become more assertive in the Congress, and some of his acts of assertion have been disastrous for the party. And in particular, he intervened in Punjab by imposing a leader on the party there, a leader who was visibly an irresponsible loose cannon. And the result of this imposition by Rahul was an embarrassing defeat for the Congress in the state election there. It goes on like this. Congress, there are glimmers of hope for Congress here and there. I specialize in the southern state of Karnataka, and I think it's quite likely that Congress, which is in good shape there, will win the next state election next year. But these are glimmers, and these are not the miracle that Congress needs, which you referred to bring it out of the doldrums. I should just say that we have a couple of questions coming in, and from the people who are participating online. And let me raise one of these questions and invite others to do so. William Horsley, who is from the Commonwealth Journalists Association, asks, what can be expected from international authorities or United Nations agencies in challenging the authoritarian actions of the Indian government, which are in breach of international norms and standards? And what role do you think the Commonwealth should play in that connection?
I think the answer is very simple. And let me, as an example, not talk about a whole range of Indian breaches of international law, but simply India's treatment of its Muslims, which to me is particularly worrying. Remember, we're talking about 14 to 15% of the country's population. In the census done in 2011, it was estimated at about 170, 180 million people. By now, because we are 11 years further down the road, we're talking about 200 million people, possibly the second largest Muslim population in any country anywhere in the world. I think it is critical that the Western press keeps raising this issue, because Indians care deeply, and this government in particular cares deeply about how it's represented by the Western press. But I think it's also important that Western governments, within Western governments, I'm not just talking about foreign ministers and prime ministers, but institutions like Congress or the House of Commons, or committees within Congress, the Foreign Affairs Committee, or religious freedom committees, raise these issues repeatedly, clearly, forcefully, because I think that message needs to go home to India, that the world is aware of what is happening. At the moment, the belief is that given India's size as a market, after all, we're talking about a potential 1.4 billion people, and given India's strategic importance as a potential check against China, there's an awful lot that the West will overlook, or at least turn a convenient Nelson's blind eye to. I think that impression needs to be dispelled, and the most effective way of dispelling it is to politely, repeatedly, but forcefully keep reminding the Indian government that there are standards of behavior that we expect from democracies. After all, what finally and eventually cements the bond between the West and India is not just economic interests and the size of the market, not just strategic interests and the fact that India is an effective check against China, but the common values we share of human rights and democracy. That is what makes India different to China, to Russia. If those common values are no longer common, if India is breaching those values and getting away with it, then India ceases to be an effective ally. It ceases to be a democracy. It ceases to be a believer in the same world, the same ideas, the same values. And I think it's important that that message should repeatedly be sent home in multiple ways, because it does matter to this government. This government is very concerned about how it is viewed, and it wants to be seen in the best possible light.
Thank you. I mean, in the same vein, Nicholas Watts has raised a question. Nicholas is an eminent figure in Commonwealth circles here. He asks, what hope is there for Commonwealth coherence and the values expressed in the Commonwealth Charter when half of the Commonwealth's population lives in a country that acts in obvious disdain for these values, and yet its government is not subject to CMAG involvement? What that means is the Indian government has not been probed and visited by a Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group concerned about departure from norms. Do you have a view on what this implies for the Commonwealth?
It suggests to me that the Commonwealth knows that its hands are tied behind its back and there's not an awful lot it can do. If a Commonwealth mission were to visit India to investigate India's human rights record, its treatment of Muslims, its treatment of journalists, its attitude to dissent, I can assure you that there would be enormous pressure from the Indian government to push back vigorously and toughly, and even threats to withdraw from the Commonwealth altogether. I think you would find that India would not be receptive. And I suspect that one reason why the Commonwealth does not send such fact-finding missions to India, even though they may well be needed, is for that very reason: fear that the response from India will be one that would be very difficult for the Commonwealth to handle. For India to leave the Commonwealth, I don't think it's likely to happen in the foreseeable future at all. But if India were to leave the Commonwealth, as you said, 50% of the Commonwealth would disappear overnight.
We have another question from Tripurdaman Singh, who is a very promising young scholar working within the Institute of Commonwealth Studies here, working on Indian politics and history. He asks about the authoritarian model that you're describing being replicated in the states, including states which are controlled by some opposition parties. The media in opposition-ruled states is being subjected to similar pressures to those that you're describing, including the use of sedition and so on. And what does this say about the possibility of things changing under an opposition government in India?
The possibility of things changing in India is always slight. You do have major changes, for instance, in 1977, when Mrs. Gandhi got defeated and the Janata Party came and reversed a lot of the improper constitutional changes she had brought. But what we're talking about is misuse of law, misuse of power, misuse of authority to put pressure on people, whether it's a Mamata Banerjee putting pressure on people who drew cartoons that she didn't like, and that's happened, or whether it's a BJP personage in Delhi. This misuse of law is intrinsic, it seems, to the Indian system. And it happens at state level, it happens at national level. The problem is that when it happens at the national level, it takes over a nationwide dimension. And because the power of the central government is so much greater, all the investigating agencies that you referred to a moment ago work under the national government. It becomes a much bigger problem. But it's beyond denying that misuse of authority, misuse of power does happen at the regional levels fairly frequently. There's no question about it. It does happen, and there are several examples of it.
I want to ask you about what are apparently calculated silences from Prime Minister Modi, and a great many silences. Now, Mr. Modi is a talkative man. He speaks often on a daily basis on a huge range of issues and topics, but he has also remained strangely silent amid the arrests of journalists, silent as extremists, Hindu extremists, physically attack minorities or call for the rapes and murders of Muslims. The Prime Minister has broken his silence, so far as I can tell. I've been watching this. He's broken his silence only twice, when he felt that his international image was being threatened. The first time was a few years ago when the New York Times ran a story criticizing India for an epidemic of beatings and murders, mainly of Muslims, by so-called cow protection activists, rakshaks. And the prime minister then, after 2 years of silence on the issue, the prime minister broke his silence and made a mild comment, regretting that these things were happening and blaming state governments for the lack of control. The second time was much more recently, when the denigration of the Prophet Muhammad by, I think, 2 BJP spokesmen caused protests from 16 governments in predominantly Muslim countries, but also from the United States government. And at that point, Modi broke his silence again briefly, and action was initiated against the 2 speakers.
Forgive me, can I interrupt there?
Yes.
I'm not aware that Modi broke his silence when those comments were passed by Nupur Sharma and Naveen Jindal. The BJP did take action, but it took action of a very interesting sort. Nupur Sharma was suspended, but she was not expelled from the party. Naveen Jindal, who I believe tweeted what she had said and tweeted a bit more as well, was expelled. However, neither have been arrested. Under Indian law, if a Muslim had tweeted or spoken in similar terms of Hindu gods, I can assure you that before he'd finished speaking, he would have been arrested. To this day, Nupur has not been arrested. And I believe that, in fact, Justice Surya Kant of the Supreme Court, in his comments about the manner in which the Nupur case has been handled, where he accused her of being responsible for everything that has happened in the country, even raised this point that people who had tweeted against her have been arrested. People she's complained about have been arrested, but she herself has not. And on that issue, I am absolutely certain, but correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think the Prime Minister had a word to say, not a word. In fact, no one in the government has spoken on that issue as far as I'm aware at all. But the most glaring of silences from the Prime Minister was in December of last year, when at a Dharma Sansad is a sort of religious conference, calls went out loudly, publicly, for a genocide of Muslims. They reverberated around the world. No one from the government to this day, and 8 months have passed, has had a word to say. Absolutely no one. And I would have thought that when people at a Dharma Sansad, the religious congregation, people who are sympathetic to the Prime Minister's cause, people on whose support he often depends, speak in this way, he would find it a moral duty, not just to admonish them in the strongest possible terms, but also to reassure Muslims that this was never going to happen. And thirdly, to clarify that he would not be Prime Minister of a country where people behaved and spoke in this way. Those, I thought, would be not just duties for a Prime Minister to follow, but moral injunctions for a politician to follow. Remember, the Prime Minister is also the leader of the country. We look up to our Prime Ministers in a way in which no longer do people in Britain look up to their Prime Ministers to set moral examples, to set a pattern or a pathway that the rest of us follow. Mr. Modi's silence after those calls for genocide failed to do precisely that.
I wonder how we should see the source of the government's actions, its drive towards authoritarianism. On the one hand, we could say, well, and I think this is fairly obvious, that those at the top of the system have a voracious appetite for power and for control. But at the same time, I wonder sometimes if the government's forceful ways are the result of insecurity, a feeling of insecurity, a feeling that they must do this in order to keep themselves in power, that they keep losing state elections, for example, which is troubling. And there are an awful lot of independent voices out there that are still dissenting. I wonder, how do you see the source of these actions? Are they, apart from the appetite for power, do you think there's a kind of sense of insecurity there?
I think what we're overlooking, and it's very wrong of us not to focus on this very sharply, is that Mr. Modi is an incredibly popular leader. He may not be the sort of leader you and I would vote for. We may have a huge, long list of criticisms, some very deep and some very troubling about him, but it's undeniable that he must be one of the most popular leaders that has ever come to power in India. And even now, at the height of COVID, his popularity remains almost intact. Even though the COVID deaths in India are alleged by researchers who I have no reason to question to be 7 to 8 times more than the official figure given by the government. In other words, 3 to 4 million people may have died rather than just the official figure of roughly 526,000. But people do not blame Mr. Modi for it. They've accepted it and they've excused him. The second thing is Mr. Modi has a capacity to put his finger on the pulse of the people and echo their thoughts and sentiments. The treatment of Muslims resonates with a lot of Hindus because he's touched on a chord that was always there. There was always an element of, how shall I put it euphemistically, discord between the two religious communities. But it was contained, it was never exacerbated, it was certainly not politicized and played upon. That is precisely what this government has done, to exacerbate it, to play upon it, and to threaten Muslims by taunts and dog whistles. So Yogi Adityanath refers to them in his speeches as Abba Jan. We all know that Abba Jan is how Muslim children refer to their fathers. He refers to what he calls the 80-20 theory, claiming that 20% has dominated 80%, and we all know that 80-20 is the proportion of Hindus versus Muslims in the Indian population, in UP in particular. We know that when he speaks about the Citizenship Amendment Act and refers to Muslim immigrants as termites, we know precisely what he's trying to do. He may claim that he's talking about illegal immigrants from Bangladesh, but the message that goes across is that Muslims are termites. This exacerbation of a discord that was perhaps always there is what is not just new and worrying, but what would threaten the fabric of India. Remember, we're talking about 200 million Indians. How long will they be happy to take this on the chin, to grit their teeth and bear it? At some point, they will respond. I'm not talking of terror and violence. I'm talking of other ways of responding. The civil, polite, disciplined movement that countered the Citizenship Amendment Act is one example. There are bound to be other examples. 200 million Indians will not quietly sit by and let themselves be quashed.
India had another episode of authoritarian government during the Indira and to some extent the Rajiv Gandhi era. I'm not speaking only of the emergency between 1975 and 77, but of Mrs. Gandhi's second time in power from 1980 to 84, and to some extent the government of her son Rajiv. In that period, from the mid-70s until 1989, the huge powers had flowed into the prime minister's office. It dominated the Indian political system, and it systematically attempted to weaken institutions within the government and to completely intimidate the Indian media. But after 1989, we had a period of 25 years until Mr. Modi was elected in 2014. We had a period in which no political party had enjoyed a dominant position. And therefore, powers in that period, that 25 years after 89, flowed away from the prime minister's office back to institutions which had been weakened under Indira and Rajiv Gandhi. And many agencies and indeed the media reasserted themselves. What we saw in that period after 1989 was a regeneration within a system which had undergone deinstitutionalization and degeneration under the Gandhis before 1989. Now, I'm just wondering, we see now a government which has radically centralized power in the Prime Minister's office, in which institutions of state have been systematically weakened, in which the media have been intimidated or enticed into a fawning praise of the government. Most of the media, there are brave exceptions to it, but most of the media has been reduced to that. I just wonder if somehow the current regime passed from the scene and a new, possibly more pluralistic government took over. Would it be possible, do you think, for these institutions, including the media, to regenerate again as they did before?
I hope so is the short answer. And that did happen pretty swiftly and fairly effectively in 77, 78 after the emergency ended. I do believe that the instinct for democracy, the love of freedom, the desire for standing up to those in power, particularly amongst journalists who realize that this is one of the most important jobs that they have to do, remains. It remains intact. It's just that they, at the moment, lack the wherewithal to do it. There's intimidation from their bosses. There's intimidation from the government. There's the great fear that if you lose your job, you become economically unviable. You can't survive. And so there are a lot of compromises that you're forced to take. You start self-censoring because you can't afford to be without a job. You can't take the risk of losing your job because you wrote an article or you anchored a program which was so critical of the government that your bosses have turned around and said, thank you, we've had enough. But I believe that those instincts remain deep within Indians. And so if this regime were to suddenly, by some miracle, by some good fairy passing a wand over our heads, change and become almost the opposite of what it is, India would bounce back pretty fast.
We have another question from John Elliott, who is interested in knowing whether the way that the government applies pressure to the media in the different language sectors, between the English language media, the Hindi language media, and other vernacular languages, are the government's pressures on these different sectors different, or does the media in these different sectors react differently to the government?
You know, I ought to begin that answer by honestly saying I don't know. However, I'm happy to venture a guess because John is a friend and I don't want to leave him without any hint of an answer at all. But please bear in mind that I'm now thinking on my feet as I speak. I'm not speaking authoritatively, and I'm certainly not speaking from any knowledge or experience I have. But I don't think the central government is particularly worried about regional language papers. That would be the bigger concern of those state governments where those papers or those channels come out. I think the central government's principal concern is Hindi language, particularly in the Hindi heartland, newspapers and channels, and obviously English language channels, because there's a well-established tradition in India that many of the stories that worry the government break on the English media first and then trickle down through the Hindi channels and Hindi newspapers to the regional ones. So I think the principal focus of the central government, this is my assumption, I underline that, would be English language newspapers channels and Hindi language newspaper channels. Regional language ones would probably be left, in fact, I think, to regional governments to worry about rather than directly for the central government. I mean, obviously, major regional papers like Amrit Bazar Patrika, which is more than just a Bengali paper, or a major paper of an equivalent sort in Tamil Nadu, would very much concern the government. But the vast plethora of regional language channels, newspapers, magazines would be something the government would at Delhi look at a remove. it will be more the concern of regional governments. That is my hunch, and I underline, I'm not speaking from personal knowledge or experience.
Thank you. We have another question from Saeed Badrul Hassan, who's asking whether growing authoritarianism in India might encourage politicians in neighboring countries to pursue a similar course. And we might even extend that that question to whether it would encourage politicians in other Commonwealth countries, since India is not being tackled by the Commonwealth. Would it encourage politicians in other Commonwealth countries to pursue a similar authoritarian course?
Well, let me disabuse you of the impression that politicians in our neighboring countries need encouragement from India to pursue an authoritarian course. They don't. They're quite happy to pursue it without any indication from India of support, and certainly without India being an example that they follow. Authoritarian electoral governments, and I'm deliberately combining those adjectives, authoritarian electoral governments are fairly common right across the subcontinent. Even, let's take the most recent example of Ranil Wickremesinghe, who has become, to everyone's surprise and astonishment, the acting president of Sri Lanka, unless he's been deposed in the last hour or so while we've been talking. His first instinct, shortly after he took over, was to declare an emergency, island-wise curfew, and to hand over complete political authority to the military to subdue the situation. Now, when an acting president says that I am giving the military full powers and creating a military supreme committee which is not to be interfered with politically, to me, that looks and sounds very much like military rule behind Wickremesinghe's civilian facade. That is authoritarianism of another sort, which he can't enforce directly, but he's getting the army to try and do it. Of course, the situation in Sri Lanka is very different, and I'm not in any sense of the terms comparing between Sri Lanka, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, etc. What I'm saying is that the instinct to be authoritarian exists right across this subcontinent, right across this region of South Asia. And I don't think our neighboring rulers need to take encouragement from India to follow the same path. They'll do it themselves quite happily and quite readily.
Thank you very much. Your comments today have been a real education and a great benefit to all of us. And we're very grateful for your time and your wisdom. I think we better let you go after an exhausting hour. I know you have an interview that you yourself will need to conduct quite soon, but many thanks for all of this and our very best wishes.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Mena. Let me just put in a word. That interview is about Sri Lanka, and it is with a man who I hugely, hugely admire, Paya Kyasoti Saravanamuttu. He's the executive director of Sri Lanka Center for Policy Alternatives. And I would say, of all the Sri Lankan analysts and political scientists that I've dealt with, one of the most intelligent, analytical, outspoken, and one who gives you clear answers rather than prevaricates. And if anyone has a chance to watch it, it'll go up on the Wire's website an hour or so after we finish the interview. I would recommend it because he has taught me an awful lot about his country, particularly during the last 1 week. And I think he would be eye-opening for everyone else.
That gives me the opportunity to say again that interviews which Karan has conducted, I mean a great many interviews that he's conducted, meticulously and fairly, appear on The Wire. That's the name of the online news platform, which is admirably brave and reliable. So people should keep that in mind as they search for solid information and stimulation. Karan, many thanks for your time and all the best wishes from us.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Mena. My thanks to you, and also my thanks to all the rest of the members of this webinar for joining us and making time to hear me.
Thanks then, and goodbye.